Trigger warning. Stalking. Coercion. Threats of violence. I should have kept walking. The rain had already eaten the hem of my jacket and the heat of the kitchen was still clinging to my skin, the way an exhausted animal keeps its fur. My shift had been 14 hours of trays, silverware that never seemed clean for long enough, and tips that added up to less than a grocery run. I had the rent column tallying in my head like a utilities. Medicine for my brother when I turned the corner and saw the car. It was the kind of black that swallowed streetlight, a shape honed by money into something dangerous and beautiful. It waited under the orange halo of a lamppost like a shadow with a pulse. The tires hissed the same rhythm as my heart when the driver stepped out. He didn't smile. He had a face made to be obeyed, parts carved and set with a patience I felt in my bones. When he looked at me, it was as if he had read my ledger and closed it with thumbs. "You've been walking in this," he said, and his voice carried across the wet like a small command. "Get in." It wasn't a question. I tasted the sourness that had nothing to do with cold coffee. I told myself I would refuse. I rehearsed lines in fine. I have a boyfriend. Called the police then, the smell of cedar and old leather, and the plain clinical danger in his posture made the rehearsed sentences fall out of me. "Why would I?" I started, but he stepped close enough that the rain made his collar glaze, and something at the base of my skull went raw with the animal knowledge that whatever this was, I couldn't outrun it tonight. He introduced himself then, as if he had all the time in the world, and the institution of introductions was a courtesy, not a need. Dante Buttorio. The name landed with the soft clack of an old machine. I had seen it in headlines, in the blur of late-night rumors filtered through taxi drivers and bartenders, a man built of rumors, who owned neighborhoods and silence. I should have been afraid in a way that made my legs betray me. Instead I felt the flat, honest fear of someone who has calculated risk until the odds are a practical matter. I told myself I was stepping into a car with a stranger who knew a dangerous name. I told myself I wasn't the person to be surprised by being watched. And yet when his hand closed on the door for me, the universe contracted. "You look tired," he said. He had a way of stating things that didn't ask for a reply and made them requests anyway. He offered his jacket as if the offer were generosity, as if the jacket would rewrite the dead economy of my life. I said, "I have to finish a shift," though my throat tasted of exhaustion more than guilt. He only said, "Come with me. I will get you dry." I got in. If you're here for the kind of stories that leave you thinking about danger that smells like perfume and heartbreak, fold it into silk, hit subscribe. The car was cold in the way that preserves things there that kept you from overheating into panic. The leather smelled faintly of smoke and citrus. A man in a suit drove. His face was careful, his hands were steady. He didn't ask for my name. Dante did, later, with an economy that could have been a courtesy or a claim. He listened to my answers the way someone reads a map. Not to learn the landscape, but to understand where to cut. He had his own rules. He would sit near me, not close enough to touch, but close enough to make the space between our bodies a measure of intent. He did not make small talk. He said the kind of things that slid into the spaces you had left unguarded, where my brother worked, what train I took to the second job, the landlord's name. I tried to pass it as coincidence, as a string of facts plucked from overheard answers. But then he reached across, thumbed the back of my wrist, and found the place where skin turned to a pale bruise. "You have a cut," he observed, as if I'd announced my name. The cut was small, a thin, stubborn red line across the knuckle where I'd slammed my hand against a stainless steel countertop. I had been hiding it under a bandage. I watched his face in the rearview mirror. He didn't flinch at the petulant imprudence of living with hurt. His eyes, the dark of them, held nothing of the waiter's bounding empathy. They catalogued. They considered cost. "People make the wrong choices," he said. "Sometimes those choices follow you." When we stopped at a light, he turned just enough for his voice to be low, a tortured ribbon of warmth and threat. "Come with me to dinner." I could have said no. I could have walked back out into the rain, taken my bruised pulse, and paid my rent the way I always did, slowly, with a song of denial humming in the background. I didn't. Sometimes the line between being brave and being tired is a small, worn coin. I had spent all my courage paying for someone else's mistakes, so I answered him like someone choosing a lesser of two violences. 1 hour. He accepted like a creditor, accepting a payment. We went to a place that seemed carved out of a different climate, warm light, curtains that swallowed the sound of the street, a private table walled off from the world. He sat across from me like a king watching a subject perform a loyalty oath. The candles made crescent moons on his jaw. The restaurant staff gave him the kind of deference that smells of security, as if they, too, had learned to be careful around the man who didn't need to be loud to be feared. He asked questions, in small doses. "Do you have someone who cares for you?" he asked at one point, and I told him about my brother, about the bills, about the nights I slept on a couch that creaked in sympathy. He nodded, a brief, almost distracted gesture, and then he asked, "Who hurt you?" The words slipped off his tongue like a trap snapping. I hadn't been thinking about who hurt me. I'd been thinking about the drawer labeled rent. The bruise on my wrist had come from a man with a temper and cheap whiskey. Saying it aloud unstitched something. I felt the thread that tied me to the bruised days unravel as he pushed. He leaned forward and reached out, not for an embrace, but for the honesty he wanted to collect. His fingers were cool when they brushed the bandage at my wrist. There was a possessive gentleness in the motion that set the warning trills in my chest like a bell shower. "Tell me," I said, as little as I could. The truth is often a heavy thing, and telling it to someone who could make reality fold into obedience was risk measured in degrees. I told him I had fallen, that the bruise was an accident, an awkward meeting between skin and steel. He didn't seem convinced. He smiled without smiling, the kind of expression that was not cruelty, but rather a clinician's curiosity at an interesting symptom. "You will face him," he said later, not as a warning, but as a statement. "No one gets to touch you and leave." His voice promised retribution as if it were a fact of nature. Night. The promise frightened me and made something like relief ignite. There was an economy to his offer's safety in exchange for answers, and I felt the simple relief of being seen, of having someone acknowledge that someone had crossed me. But the seeing came with conditions. He had already decided that he wanted the truth, and he had the means to make me deliver it. I left the restaurant with Dante as if in a dream of mirrored aliveness. He walked me to his car, draped his jacket over my shoulders with the practiced intimacy of someone who had dressed many women and, in each offering, had been careful to mark possession with the gentlest possible violence. The touch was not tender. It was a signature. The next morning, my shift manager, Carlos, looked at me like I had been punched in the night. "What happened to your arm?" he asked. There was the question that, for months, I had trained myself to deflect. I offered a joke, instead a story, about the oven door, about me being clumsy with the tray, and he laughed, but the laugh was thin. I saw him write something down, lending eyes, a friend, tally in concern. Later, a man in a suit arrived at the diner, a polite animal carrying a check with my landlord's name on it. "Rent paid? Notice deferred." There was no signature that meant anything to me until I saw Dante's handwriting on a small card tucked into the envelope, a name and an address, and another line beneath it that read, "Dr. Russo, private practice." I didn't want to go to a doctor who smelled of cedar and power, but the bruise was swelling towards infection in ways that felt both literal and symbolic. My brother's cough had become a small, angry sound in the apartment, and the idea of paying for medicine had the intimacy of a grave. When the envelope came with rent and the doctor's name, I felt a dangerous gratitude. Gratefulness is an arrangement. You accept care and, in the same breath, owe something intangible. Dr. Russo was efficient. He moved with a hands-on kind of competence that made me want to trust him, because his hands said more than his words. He stripped the bandage, cleaned the knuckle with a cool, antiseptic press that smelled like hospitals and the kind of procedural kindness that hospitals invent to justify their lights. The cut was shallow but angry, a pale bruise blooming in yellow and violet around it. He asked about antibiotics oral, a course that would chase the inflammation, and told me to keep it dry, to elevate my hand when I slept. "Do you live alone?" he asked in the professional register that kept concern at a safe distance. I said yes. That yes felt like admitting a vulnerability on a bank deposit slip. He gave me a small packet of antibiotics, gauze, and a little tube of Savand. Then he handed me a paper. It wasn't a bill. It was a checkout notice with Dante Vittorio's station in the corner, like a watermark. His voice behind me was low when he said, "If he asks, tell him the wound is healing." Dante didn't ask for permission to enter my life. He used the power of provision the way a man with the world's appetite uses a gift, as both balm and leash. He paid for my shifts to be covered for a week, ostensibly to let me rest, to recover. He offered to set up payments for my brother's schooling, to find him a steady position that would keep him warm in winter and sober of spirit. He sent food late at night, stacked with the same precise care that a man would take with an arrangement measured calories. Familiar tastes, something arranged to feel like an offering rather than a transaction. I felt the churn inside me. Shame, relief, suspicion. When Marcus, Dante's driver, and the man who carried his silences like a uniform, began to appear in places he had no reason to be on the train to the evening college class I had been thinking about enrolling in, waiting at the cafe where my brother worked, stopped thinking of it as absence of coincidence and started thinking of it as a plan. When a scholarship offer came with a note signed by one of Dante's foundations and improbable offer sent to me at the post office box with my name on the envelope, I realized we had crossed a threshold. My life was being smoothed by hands that had always been kept away from me. Dante's villa was a quiet country carved out of money. The air around it tasted like citrus, and loud weather held at bay. He took me there one afternoon to show me things, he said, as if I were something that needed to be exhibited. Inside, the light fell in rectangles. There was art curated into silence. The house smelled of cedar, and the faint trace of gun oil folded into the cushions like an afterthought. He showed me a garden where citrus trees bowed like obeying elders, and a study where books were organized by weight rather than by author. The sort of method that suggests someone organizes lives the way he must organize debts. We sat in the study, with 2 glasses of something strong that warmed from the inside out. He asked about my brother, about the number of the landlord, about the way the city had shaped my edge. He asked and answered like a man who already possessed each truth he sought. He placed his hand by my knee, not close enough to touch but close enough to remind me he could. "You trust the wrong people, because you have to," he said. There was no accusation in it, only an inventory. Flaws catalogued, solutions proposed. "I don't want you to be one of those mistakes anymore." "Why me?" I asked. The question was less philosophical than practical. Men like Dante operated with hunger that was indiscriminate and omnivorous. There are always more people to be rescued, or to be broken, or to be assigned as someone else's lesson. He smiled, that small, enough smile, because you were there. Because you were visible. He liked to use words that made me feel like an object exposed to light. Visibility had become a commodity in his voice. It was easier to answer questions about why he chose me if I accepted that being seen was sometimes a currency. But visibility, I was learning, could be a cage with mirrors. One evening, as rain tire-sipped the street outside my building, Marcus came to my door with a folder. He handed it to me like a solemn thing. I had expected a letter, another check, a bill. Instead, the folder opened to reveal a collection of photographs, windows of my life, pinned together in a file stitched with someone's attention. There were photos of me coming off an evening shift, hair in a messy bun, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. There were images from the train platform, one of me trying to read a battered paperback between stops, my face turned toward a passing blur of light. There were more intimate shots, an arm reaching past a dumpster for a dropped bandage. The quick, ridiculous smile I made when the cashier at the corner store handed me the wrong change. Each picture was stamped with a date, sometimes with small notations, 6:42 p.m., returns 7:15. It wasn't just the photos. It was the method! Someone had tracked my movements and recorded them, making a map of my small, private patterns. "You keep this," Marcus said, and for the first time his face held a human question. "He wants you to know he's been watching. He thinks it's better when the person who is watched understands how carefully they're held." The language of being held again, only this time it was literal. The room tilted. The photographs felt less like evidence and more like a confession of ownership. They were the proof that someone had been drawing the lines of my days while I worked inside them. I had been treated before, not with money, but with the casual brutality of a world that keeps people small. This was different. This was a man who had used resources to build a net. I folded the photos back into their envelope and put them on the kitchen table. I thought of everything they had cost: time, intrusion, decisions that placed my safety in the ledger of someone else's power. I thought about my brother sleeping in the next room with a cough that had not yet been admitted as illness, about the rent that was paid without my asking, about the way the scale between gratitude and violation had shifted. When I confronted Dante, much later, he said it was protection. It was a doctor. It was a courtesy. Each word mapped to a reason that rearranged my consent into something I had not signed. His explanations were elegant. His voice made them into absolution. "You are not free from harm when no one sees you," he told me one night, when he stopped by my apartment with soup that tasted faintly of cedar and the sort of meticulous warmth designed to translate as care. He sat on the edge of the couch and watched me eat, as if he found some deep, private reassurance in witnessing me consume something warm without spilling it. "When you are seen, you are protected. You will still be hurt. That's the world, but I can make it so the people who have hurt you will answer for it." "Who gets to decide that?" I asked. My voice sounded like gravel. The question pierced my own architecture. Who gave anyone the right to rewrite my life as a ledger to be balanced? Dante's reply was a practiced thing. "I do." There are many kinds of power. Some people hold it like a flag. Dante wore his like a seamstress's instrument, invisible, precise, used to stitch a life into something he meant to own. I kept my hand under the table, because I did not want him to see the tremor of it. He did not need to see it to know it was there. He had, after all, watched me count my pennies with the same devotion he used to watch men disappear. Watching is a kind of hunger. It can look like care when the eater is gentle. When the surveillance folder appeared, something in me folded the way a paper folds around a secret. I sat with the photographs through the night, turning them as if their cardboard could explain the logistics of my life. I tried to imagine a stranger with a camera, a man with a motorbike, a margin between consent and compulsion. I tried to make the invasion into a story I could tell at parties, an anecdote about a rich man who had a gallant side. The truth refused to be shrunk into a joke. At the bottom of the folder was a photograph of my wrist, the bruise clear, the bandage half peeled, the knuckle marked in post-trauma bloom. Someone had taken a close-up, an image that had required time and intent. There was a small notation beside it, written in a neat hand. "Explain." I slid the photograph back into the file. The paper was warm from being in someone's pocket. I thought of the man who had asked me to tell him the truth about that bruise, who had leaned into me at dinner and said, "You will face him." I thought about his hands as Dr. Russo's were cleaning my cut. Competence and something else. Something with the capacity to change the shapes of lives. I kept my agency like a small, fragile coin in my mouth. I had choices that felt impossible. To step further into a sanctuary that had been built with my movement traced on a map, or to walk away with the knowledge that every step I took might be watched, that my vulnerability could be used as currency. The folder on my table was not just a collection of images. It was proof that the man who had offered me shelter had also built a perimeter around my life. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought of the man who had made his quiet offer at the lamppost by naming me without asking. I thought of why a person chooses to save another. There are 1,000 ways to mean protections. Some come with a hammer, others with a feather. Dante's had come with both. He had given me rent, medicine, a future stitch for my brother, and in exchange, he had asked for sight. When I saw him again, his look was both unchanged and shaped like a question. He stood by the window as if the rain were his curtain, and he said, softly, "I don't want anyone to touch you and get away with it." His words were simple. My own response was complicated with everything I had been taught about survival. Gratitude, distrust, the habit of negotiating my dignity for bread. Part of me wanted to be grateful for the safety offered. Part of me understood, too clearly, the price being levied. I wanted to weigh the cost of being seen visible, fed, housed, and decide if the safety he promised was worth the fragmentation of my privacy. "You will face him," he told me again, in a voice that was not a threat so much as a roadmap. "You will tell me the truth about that bruise." There it was, the line everyone would remember. He asked me to face him, to admit what had been done, to place my wound in his ledger and let him balance the books. To him, truth had a practical function. Information turned into action. For me, truth had always been a thing wrapped in shame and small silences. To tell him would be to give him more territory in my life. To hide it would be to preserve the last small room that was mine. I told him the truth. It was not a confession so much as a transaction. The facts placed squarely on the table and offered a mirror to his intent. The man who had bruised me was someone I knew in the generic way of low-level violence. A man with too much anger and too little money, who made a habit of thinking of women as things you could mark. He had taken away nothing of material value. He had taken the idea that my body could stay unwound. The bruise was a statement, not a theft. An attempt to rewrite my boundaries without asking. Dante listened as if he were taking notes in a ledger. He asked nothing in response, only watched my face for the tremor, for the soft lie that people sometimes add to make their own lives less sharp. When I finished, the room was different. The light across his jaw made him look older. Not older in age, but older in responsibility. There was a pause where the history of my life hummed between us. "You will face him," he said again. Softer now. And for a moment the words carried the promise of protection rather than the threat of ownership. "I'll make them answer." I wanted to believe him. I wanted, more than anything, to feel safe without paying for it. I wanted a world where consequences happened because laws made them, not because a man decided to balance wrongs on his own scale. But the world was not that neat. His offer was not justice as the state defines it. It was retribution served in private. There would be soft consequences that lodged under fingernails, unexpected retaliation, a ledger heavy with names. He left me a card with a number and a short set of instructions. "If anyone bothers you, call. Do not tell anyone I'm involved." In the days that followed, his involvement showed up in small, gilded ways. Marcus blinking politely at the cafe manager. My brother offered a steady job at a place that paid a living wage. My landlord's voice over the phone, soft as if someone had whispered a name at the end of a complaint. Each concession bent my life into a safer shape, but it also trimmed corners in a way that left neat little notches where privacy used to be. There are 1,000 kinds of rescues. Some require no payment. Most of the practical ones do. I found myself bargaining without meaning to, trading my silence for clean water, my loyalty for rent, my privacy for protection. I learned their language quickly. Watchful care was the same vocabulary as control. It sounded different depending on which end of the sentence you stood. One night, after a week of paid shifts and meals that arrived on my doorstep like apologies, I opened the folder again. This time I didn't skirt its edges. I sat with each photograph and catalogued the angles that had been taken. Not accidental at all, but planned angles meant to capture my small habits. I thought about my choices. I thought about Dante's hands on my wrist and the neat directive to face him. I thought of the man who had bruised me and whether facing him would mean speaking in a way the law might respect, or in the way a ledger understands names balanced by silence. There is a crooked morality to being saved by someone willing to do harm to get justice. The philosophy sounded like a bargain to me. Safety exchanged for something that will never be entirely mine. I didn't want to be owned. I didn't want the safety he offered to come with so many small, sticky threads attached. And yet when Marcus left the folder and the lights went out across the city like a mass evacuation, I felt the pull of being seen in a different shade. It is a strange thing to be visible in a world that prefers people invisible until they are needed. The photographs said I mattered enough to map. That was both flattering and terrifying. When Dante called the next afternoon and asked me to come to his office, I said I would. He had a habit of presenting decisions as kindnesses done for my convenience. This one felt like an inspection. I arrived to find him in the same chair he had occupied at dinner, but this time his posture carried the business of a man who sorts lives into what they can be. On his desk was a tablet. He tapped it, and the screen flickered. Photos, timestamps, small annotations I could not read. He set the tablet toward me. "Do you see how close they've been?" he asked. I saw myself in dozens of frames. I saw the world as if through someone else's hunger. In the corner of the screen, The notation repeated exprem Bruise. The command sat there like punctuation. You will face him, he said, and this time the sentence did not have the ripple of a promise. It was a directive. I had told him the truth already, yet the demand persisted, not for truth, but for surrender. He wanted me to do more than confess. He wanted me to give him the right to fix it his way. The photographs were proof that the world already moved under his gaze. The tablet in front of me was the ledger of my life, rendered in pixels. The choice he offered was plain. Allow him to translate the hurt into his terms, or step back and keep whatever privacy I still possessed. Do you want me to make them answer in court? He asked, lightly. I thought of the bruise and the man who had given it, a small, unremarkable figure in a city of unremarkable violence. I thought of the night the car had waited like a predator under a street lamp and the simplicity of his offer to fix things. I thought of the photographs, of rent paid, of a brother with less cough. I thought of what it might cost me to let him do as he pleased. I don't know, I said. He folded his hands together, the kind of stillness that meant promises were being calculated. Either way, he said, we make this right. There was a logic to his words that felt both comforting and predatory. He did not flatter me with sentiments about autonomy. He treated autonomy like a variable, useful, to be adjusted as circumstances required. I left his office that night with a plan rolling inside my head like a stone in a pocket. He had given me shelter, medicine, work for my brother. He had also watched me, folded my days into a book I had not written. That is how I came to understand the bargain I had been offered. Safety for visibility. The question weaved through my days like a persistent fly: was the trade worth it? Could I live under the warm, suffocating blanket of someone else's watch if it meant my brother's cough would shrink and our landlord would stop cutting us off at the knees? Could I trade the small, sharp freedom of being unseen for the certainty of care? I kept telling myself I would decide after the bruise healed. I told myself I would step away if the surveillance became too much. I told myself I had time. The truth, as it often does, moved my plans into the category of folly. When Marcus left me another envelope a week later, inside was a single photograph and a short note. We can move faster than you think. The photograph was of a man no name, no face fully visible, standing outside a bakery where I sometimes ate breakfast on my single day off. His shadow fell wrong. The message did not need translation. I stared at the image as if it could be burned. The city outside my window hissed and the radiator clicked. A domestic orchestra. But a new sound had threaded itself into the score. The knowledge that my life was not merely being watched but edited. Protection, I was learning, could be a razor that leaves clean cuts and slow scars. I sat very still and folded my hands so I would not feel my pulse. The ledger had changed. The things Dante purchased, the rent, the doctor, the scholarship, were not merely gifts. They were down payments on an arrangement. I had been given the opportunity to breathe, but the air tasted faintly of someone else's smoke. I had to decide if surrendering privacy for safety was surrendering my soul. I had to decide if being seen by a man like Dante was better than being invisible and unprotected. The photograph on the table was only a small piece of evidence. It was not yet a threat, but it felt like a promise, one step away from being enforced. The rain started again that night. The kind of steady that made streets into rivers and thoughts into pools. I looked at my wrist, at the fading violet that had once been sharp, and felt the track of decisions starting behind it. I could almost hear the books he kept in his study, organized by weight, waiting for me to choose which shelf I would stand on. I had to meet him again. I wanted to know what he would do, and I feared the answer. I understood in a premonitory way that when a man like Dante offers to take charge of your life, the cost might not always be counted in money. When I arrived at his villa the next afternoon, he led me to the study as if this were the next movement of a symphony. Marcus closed the door behind us with the sound of a verdict being sealed. He tapped the tablet and set it between us. The photos scrolled past to my face at the bus stop. My brother smiling at a new uniform. The man who had bruised me caught in a distant frame near a strip of graffiti. He watched me watch his catalogue of my life. And then, quiet as a commandment, he said, "You will face him. Tell me everything." There is a way. Those words can be soft or hard, depending on the mouth makes them. In his mouth they held both. a protection and an ultimatum, a promise and a trap. My truth had already been told, in drab detail to the sterile hands of a doctor, and in the small telling I had done over dinner, but the demand for repetition carried an extra weight. He wanted not only my confession but my consent to let him wage the retribution he had already begun to plan. "You will face him," he repeated, like a loop of authority. The tablet between us glowed, and the rain outside blurred into a vision of a city where private justice is a commodity and safety has a price. I thought of my brother's cough, the way his shoulder had ached when he came home from the mechanic, the way rent had been paid this month without my having to beg. I thought of the folder on my kitchen table, and the way Dante's offers had begun to remake small rooms of my life into safer places at a cost I had yet to calculate. I told him the rest of it not to absolve myself, not to seek salvation, but because telling felt like carving a path through the dark. I told him where I had been, who I had known, what the bruise had meant, and what it had taken from me. I watched his hand tap the tablet as he listened, like a judge writing notes. He did not flinch when I told him the name of the man who had raised his hands to me. Instead, he nodded in that almost distracted way of a man who keeps decisions like tools. When I finished, he made a small, decisive sound. "Good," he said. "Soon, you'll face him. Not because I want you to relive it, but because sometimes you have to decide if you want the world to see what was done to you." I had thought the demand to face him was about truth. I was beginning to see it was about establishing a narrative I allowed him to control. Outside, the rain declined into a thin drizzle. Inside, the tablet blinked like a heart monitor. I realized then that the tablet was not just a ledger but a heartbeat, steady, mechanical, the hum of a life maintained by means I was invited into but never asked to sign for. The light on the screen blinked with the same rhythm as my own pulse. And in that moment, the tidy difference between protection and possession blurred until it was almost impossible to see the edge. Later that week, something happened that made the ledger stop pretending to be only ink and pixels. It started like all bad things start in my life, small, boring, and then urgent. A text came through at noon. A photo of my brother in his new jacket, smiling at a counter at the garage, a message under it. "Good work. Keep it up." I smiled because it was the thing Dante had set up, the visible proof that he was keeping his end. Then, that same day, a man in a hoodie lingered too long at the end of my street. He stared at my door for a long time, as if trying to memorize the cracks around it. I noticed him because Marcus arrived 10 minutes later in a car I recognized and lingered 3 houses down with the engine running. He walked toward the man like a shadow and said nothing. The man left. That should have been the end of it, but the next night, as I came home from a class I had finally begun an evening literature course. Dante had quietly paid my tuition, for Van idled where there had been none. My bag felt heavy with textbooks and the faint thrill of learning. My heart felt lighter than it had in months. I walked with a practiced blankness that the city trains into you head down, pace even. A door of the van hissed, and someone grabbed my arm from behind. I remember cold hands, the slap of my bag across my back when I twisted, the sudden, efficient clatter of someone trying to pull me inside. The world narrowed to the hiss of rain and a tinny, distant alarm from a car that had failed to start. I heard my own breath become an animal sound. I remember thinking of my brother's cough and of the rent card tucked into my pocket like a hidden coin. The man who hit my wrist was not the one who had left the bruise before. He was rougher around the edges, thinner and sloppier, his temper held together by a jagged patience. He was, we learned later, one of the small-time players who sold information to people who wanted to know which women in a neighborhood were easy to frighten. He meant to take me for leverage, maybe to get Dante's attention, maybe to hand me over to someone who would make me vanish for a night or two. Something else happened, too, something honest and blunt. I had a small panic device in my bag. Marcus had slipped it to me 2 weeks earlier when he noticed how often I looked around when I crossed the plaza. "If anyone touches you, press it," he had said simply. I had kept it somewhere under my receipts, because the idea of having a tracker felt both invasive and practical. I pressed it then, with a thumb that did not want to betray the shock. I had no time to think about consent or the ethics of being saved. I had time for survival. The van's back doors were flung open, and a boot connected with the small of my back. I hit the metal with a sound that was too clean to be just pain. And then the world erupted into a different texture. Car doors slamming. A voice in a low register that didn't bother with vowels. And a noise I would remember for a long time, the unmistakable pop of a gun fired, but not the loud, cinematic crack of a movie weapon. It was muffled, efficient, the sound of a man removing a problem from the list rather than the sound of theater. When the van doors shut again, they were empty. The man who had held me was gone. There was no blood, no cinematic violence. There was a small, fierce absence where threat had been. My knees betrayed me, and I would have fallen if Marcus had not caught me. He smelled of cedar and winter. He had a cigarette in his mouth and didn't bother to hide the trembling in his hands. "You all right?" he asked, and I could hear the calculus of relief and fury in his voice. He talked to me like we were colleagues in an office about to file a serious complaint. He pressed a paper napkin into my hand, and the grip of it felt like an offer and an apology at once. "Where did they go?" I asked, stupidly professional, as if we were writing an incident report. "Not far," he said. "They won't be back." There were no eulogies for the vanished threat. There were no speeches about justice. Marcus's face was tight and practical as he guided me into the car and told me where I was going. Dante's villa. He did not ask if I wanted to go there. He took me. It was not an elegant rescue. It was efficient. The study smelled like cedar and the faint iron of someone who had dealt with weapons. Dante was there, as if he had been waiting for that exact second to slide into it. He did not run to me or show frantic grief. He sat opposite me and watched me like someone reading a ledger and deciding when to close the book. "You're safe," he said. It was not meant to be comforting. It was meant to be factual. He tapped the tablet, and the screen showed fragmented footage, not cinematic, but enough. A shaky frame where the man in the van was visible. A camera across the street that had watched the event with clinical disinterest. There were other frames, too, of men who looked like they'd been taught to be violent for a purpose. There were notes in a handwriting I had come to recognize as his, removed from circulation. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. His voice was stripped of flourish. It was the voice of someone assessing a machine part. "No," I said. My jaw ached from clenching. "Not physically." He let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "They won't again," he said. I wanted to hate him for the easy certainty of that statement. I wanted to hate the private justice that didn't have to pass through police stations and forms. I wanted to keep the last of my illusion that justice wore a green municipal jacket and spoke in monotone. Instead, I felt something else. A frightened relief that was too complicated to be pure. The next day, there were consequences. A rumor got out that a few men had simply vanished from circulation. No memorial, no public record. Just a spine of missing names. Men who had made a habit of preying on women at night stopped doing it in that neighborhood. The cafe blocked certain corners. My brother stopped working back-to-back shifts and his cough eased like a thing that had been given a rest break. Dante called once to ask if I needed anything. I told him no, which was true in the most shallow way. I needed no bandages, no medication, no money. What I needed was a category for what had happened, a place to put my shaking so it would not take over. That did not mean there were no I couldn't shake the knowledge that someone had decided for me what justice would look like. I couldn't forget the sound the gun had made, the efficient manner in which an enforcer can remove a problem. I slept badly and woke with the taste of cedar on my lips, and the wrong knowledge that tidy endings can be bought with enough influence and enough discretion. Dante's intervention had produced safety, yes, but it had also scaled my life toward his rhythm. I had to learn which corners belonged to me and which had been curated by someone else. There was a new operating manual for my days. Marcus appearing with health certificates, small gestures from Dante, a coat folded over a chair, a book left on the table with an unbroken line of notes in the margin. He seemed to be trying to teach me the grammar of his care. One night, after a week when the world felt quieter, he asked me to come into the villa's small room they called the guest suite. Marcus closed the door lightly and left us alone. The room smelled of clean linen and the faint, metallic trace of an office. Dante sat on a chair across from me the way a man sits when he is going to offer a contract. "You could leave," he said. His voice held the casualness of someone offering a menu choice. I could, I said. It sounded ridiculous to list it like an option. But then what? Then I'd make you disappear, he said. I have ways to make you safe. Safe how? My voice betrayed more anger than I had expected. Safe by being watched. Safe by having the people who hurt me removed from the world. Safe by living in a house where men like Marcus choose who gets to stand in my kitchen. He listened to my list like someone taking notes at a deposition. Safety is not perfect, he said gently. It is what keeps you breathing. I could give you a life with no knocks on the door and a brother who doesn't cough. I could ensure that creditors stop bothering you. I can make your days not be a ledger of small emergencies. At what cost? I asked. The words came out sharper than I intended. I was asking, I realized, not about money, but about soul. You keep your freedom, he said. You still decide. It was an answer as neat as any ledger entry. It left me with the impression that he had chosen to present power as neutral, something that could be owned by the one who was polite enough to call it provision. Do you expect gratitude? I asked, because sometimes that's what choices force you to admit. Who owes whom? I expect truth, he said. That little exchange was a mirror of everything I'd been living. Truth, in his mouth, was not necessarily about confession. It was about the narrative you allowed someone to frame. He had demanded I face the man who had bruised me. He wanted to know that I had told the story he could repair. He wanted me to speak my wound into his ledger and allow him to resolve it. I did something that surprised even me. I asked a question, a small one that opened a door rather than slammed it shut. If I let you do this, will you stop watching everything else? Will you let me have pockets of my life that belong only to me? He folded his hands. For a moment there was something almost tender in his stillness. No, he said honestly. I will never stop watching. That is how I keep you safe. It was a frankness that might have been cruel, if not also practical. He did not hide his intent. He did not pretend he would vanish from my life like a helpful angel. He would be there, for better and worse. It was not a bargain I had been asked to consider with clean hands. It was a choice between known danger and curated captivity. I thought of my brother and of the stable pay that had kept him from coughing through an extra shift. I thought of rent paid for a month, and of the small dignity of not having to ask for spare change at the pharmacy. I thought of the night in the van and the way someone's hands had thought my body a negotiable thing. I thought of how few of us in my neighborhood had the luxury of picking between two evils. Most of us pick the one that keeps us breathing. What if I say no? I asked. Then you leave, he said simply. I will make sure you can leave. The neatness of that sounded like a parable. He would make my escape possible, but perhaps not pleasant. He imagined a version of leaving where he cut me loose with a clean hand, an act of generosity that would still be owned by him because he had paid the price of the exit. I made my decision, not in a moment of romantic surrender, but in a methodical collision of values. I wanted my brother to be healthy, and for the landlord not to breathe down our back at the number 1 on the calendar. I wanted the slow possibility of a life where I could go back to school and not think about the cost for every hour. I wanted less fear to fold in my chest during the night. Those were practical things. I also wanted to keep a private room in my life, a place where I could go and not be catalogued. I negotiated that with him in small ways. Through the blunt, clumsy language of survival, Marcus would not come into the apartment without warning. I would be allowed to keep a small shoebox of letters unsupervised. Dante would not insert himself into the classroom I attended, unless I invited him. He listened and nodded and made the sort of concessions that looked like freedom while still maintaining the structure of his watch. It sounds like capitulation. Maybe it was. But capitulation sometimes buys you the right to breathe. When I consented to let him make the man who had bruised me answer, I did so with my eyes open. We arranged a meeting that would be public in the most private of ways. A chance encounter on a street where Dante's men would make sure the man didn't have backup, where I could face him without fear of him being backed by his usual small crew. I insisted on 2 things: witnesses from the community center, where I volunteered, and a doctor or counselor present. I wanted protocols. It was an attempt to translate private justice into a format that resembled accountability. On the appointed day, the man stood where Dante's men had told us he would. I walked up to him head high in a way I had not been able to practice in front of mirrors. He looked smaller than he had the night of the bruise, tired in a way that suited his station. He looked surprised to see me. "You hurt me," I said, because I realized then how little truth there is in whispers. The truth feels better when it is spoken in a loud room. His eyes flicked to the men standing around him, Dante's men, silent as cliffsand, then away. He muttered something like regret, something cheap that tried to be apology. The counselor nodded, wrote things down. I told him what had been taken. A night of safety, a belief in my body as my own, a little piece of the ability to walk unafraid. He had nothing to give that would make it right in the way the law often cannot. "You will face him," Dante said then. But it sounded different. The phrase had been repeated so often by him that it had transformed from command into ritual. This time, it was not for show. It was for me. He did not need to do anything theatrical. He merely sat back and let the community see what he had arranged. The man who had bruised me received a small, public reprimand arranged by people who had less power than Dante, and yet were given the space to speak with dignity. It was imperfect. It was also the only kind of retribution that would leave a paper trail, a tiny, stubborn record. After the meeting, the man left town. We never got closure in the judicial sense. He was a footnote, but suffice to say his pattern of praying had shifted elsewhere. In its place, something practical happened. Neighborhood watches formed, people looked up from their phones. Conversations started about safety in ways that were less polite and more useful. And for me, there was the small, quieter aftermath. I had spoken. I had let the man who had bruised me know that I was not a body to be marked without consequence. I had done it with a man at my side who had the means to enforce consequences, but had also allowed the community to participate. That mixed private muscle and public witness made the world tilt in a way I could work with. Dante watched me as these events unfolded. There was a patience to him during the meeting, a reserve that looked almost like respect. Later, when it ended, and we sat alone in his car with the rain soft around the villa, he did something I didn't expect. He reached across and took my hand. It was small, and it meant everything. His thumb rubbed the knuckles beside the bruise that was fading into a pale crescent. "You did well," he said. "Did I?" I asked, because sometimes bravery is a thing you have to test. "You stood up," he said simply. To him, yes. To whoever thinks they can own you. To the idea that someone else could decide whether you were worth being safe. The words were not romantic. They were not flowery. They were practical praise. We did not leap into each other's arms that night. What happened was quieter and, in certain ways, more intimate. We shared a meal, sat close enough that his shoulder brushed mine. There was a long conversation where I told him, badly and haltingly, about the small things that had haunted me as a child, how being invisible had been a currency as valuable as bread. He listened. He told me small things in return about the ledger of his life, the cost of silence, the reasons he preferred to act rather than to wait for a court that moved like a glacier. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that his violence would only land on those who deserved it and not bleed into my world again. I also wanted to keep my privacy and to not become a trophy in a life that loved to collect things. That night we walked back to his villa through a drizzle. When we reached the study, he did not propose anything grand. He said, softly, "You can stay here if you want, or you can go home." I looked at him and, for the first time, felt the weight of the choice, as if it were a real thing I could hold. I thought about the warmth of his home, the consistent meals, the doctor who would watch over my brother like a benevolent threat. I thought about the fact that the world still had men who would try to hurt me. I thought, with a surprising clarity, of the small boxes I still wanted to keep, my shoebox of letters, my free nights at the library. I chose, deliberately, to sleep there beside him that night. Not because I was coerced, but because the option of sleeping somewhere without fear felt like enough. What followed was complicated and tender and flawed. Our intimacy did not happen as a single, cinematic event. It unfolded over weeks in gestures, hands finding wrists, and not claiming. A kiss that was careful and then not. A night when I initiated because I wanted to see if desire could exist beside fear, and he accepted with a care that was both expert and hesitant. We had rules. I insisted on them. No surprise appearances at my classroom, explicit consent before any touch that meant more than a hand on the back. He agreed. Sex happened in a way that made me feel in control, for perhaps the first time since the Bruise nights. I wasn't freed from the knowledge that he could, with an order, make problems vanish. That part of the ledger was always there. But in the small dark of his bed, when he traced the line of my scar with a fingertip and didn't flinch, there was a human tenderness that could exist without being an auction. "I will never tell you love is easy," he murmured once, as fingers threaded through mine in the slow language of after. "But I will tell you, it's the thing I try to keep from being stolen from you." Consent was clear in the space we built. Lines were drawn, words were used, boundaries respected. Their presence didn't make the moral quagmire vanish. It simply meant that the intimacy we made together was, as best as it could be, my choice. Months passed in a stitchwork of small changes. Dante's influence smoothed edges in my day-to-day. My brother had a steady job that paid enough to cover his cough medicine. Tuition money arrived from my evening classes, and our landlord, when he finally called, used a tone that suggested he had been politely threatened into civility. I enrolled in more classes. I took a job at the community center, teaching a literacy class to adults who had never finished high school. That work grounded me in a way the villa never could. The students reminded me that my life was not only in the wealthy rooms where men organized debts. There were other costs. My nights were less unpredictable but also less private. Marcus would sometimes knock when he came to deliver something and linger on the porch like a sentinel. I grew used to it. I learned to guard the small things I kept for myself. The shoebox, the corner where I kept my childhood photograph of my mother smiling at a beach I never saw again. I built small rituals. A morning walk that was mine alone. A cup of coffee at the same bench where I read. One winter, Dante asked me to marry him. The proposal was not cinematic. No kneeling, no fireworks, no public display. He invited me to the study where we'd had so many difficult conversations, and sat across from me with a ring that was simple and heavy and felt like a decision to be signed. He offered no elegant speeches. He gave a set of terms of affection and protection, and a request that I marry him not just for protection but because he wanted to keep me visible in his life, not as possession but as partner. "Do you want this?" he asked. The question was precise. It was not a demand. It was an offer. I thought of how the ledger had shifted the shape of my days and how my brother's cough had eased. I thought of the small freedoms I had negotiated and how some of my autonomy had been traded for certainty. I thought of the way the man who had bruised me had disappeared from my geography and how much of that absence had to do with the man seated across from me. "Do you want me inside your life?" I asked back, because the question mattered as much as the ring. "I do," he said. "But not to own you, to stand where I can protect you." It was a strange phrasing, protection, as partnership rather than possession. The idea of a marriage like that made me think of contracts and also of shelter. I decided, again deliberately, to say yes. Our wedding was small, held in a registry office with a few people present. My brother, Marcus, a woman from the community center, who had become a friend, and Dr. Russo, who came because he'd been a practical presence in my recovery. There was no large party or public declaration. There was a legal acknowledgement, a swap of rings, and something that felt like a seal. Afterward, life settled into a new rhythm that was less dramatic and more domestic in the slow, honest sense of the word. I began teaching in the afternoons and returned to the small apartment we kept. Despite being offered the villa as a primary residence, Dante respected that. He said, "A person must have a place that isn't curated by someone else's hands." My brother moved into a better place and his cough was almost gone. Marcus still checked in, but his visits became fewer and less urgent. Dr. Russo remained a cautious friend who insisted on checking wounds and moods with the same clinical care he gave any patient. The ledger never fully disappeared. I would be lying if I said it did. There were times I caught Dante in the act of watching his silhouette at a window, the way his eyes catalogued faces in a room, and I felt the old prickle of being observed. But there were also moments that made the ledger seem less like a cage and more like a complicated tool. He brought flowers sometimes for no reason. He celebrated my small victories. Finishing a semester, a lecture that had gone well, a scholarship that had covered a late tuition. We argued, of course. There were nights where the moral edge of his private justice prickled, and I would ask, sharply, who gives you the right to decide who lives and who doesn't? He would answer, sometimes with impatience, sometimes with honesty. I can't rewrite the world, he would say. I can only make it so you don't have to face certain things alone. In the quiet hours, with the villa behind him and the neighborhood folding its laundry in the summer air, I learned to live with a mistrust that was also a gratitude. There was no pure narrative that I could stand behind. The man I loved or the man I lived with was tender in ways I had not expected and dangerous in ways that never fully settled. Love, in our version, had the shape of a ledger. Entries made, costs calculated, balances never quite equal. Years later, there was a small moment that held the weight of everything that had happened. We were in the kitchen of our apartment that first spring after the wedding. Sunlight slanted across the counter and made the dust motes look like tiny planets we lived inside. Dante had just made coffee the way he did now, with precision, like a ritual. I was folding a stack of laundry, a mundane choreography I had learned to enjoy. My brother was in the next room, laughing at a message someone had sent, the sound in the house like a small, consistent heartbeat. He came up behind me without knocking and slipped his hands around my waist in that casual ownership that sometimes made me bristle and sometimes made me melt. His thumb found the scar on my forearm and traced it the way someone reads a map of an old battle. You ever think about it? He asked softly. About then? All the time, I said. Truthful. You don't forget what carved you. You learn to live with its geography. He kissed the thin line where the bruise had been, until the scar was warm under his lips. He didn't try to romanticize it. He treated it like a fact. You told me once you didn't want to be owned, he said. The sentence floated between us. I didn't, I answered. I still don't. He tightened his arms in a way that was protective and not possessive. And then, for the first time, in a long time, I believed him when he said he would keep me safe, without treating me like property. He had changed the terms, perhaps by inviting me into his world properly, with a ring and a name and an agreement that looked like love and like contract at the same time. I can't promise to be perfect, he said. I can promise to be here, and I want to be here because I want to choose you every day. Choice. That was the word that mattered. Not the illusion of absolute freedom. Few of us ever possessed that, but the daily choosing that made life believable. I had chosen him with my eyes open, knowing what he could do and what that could cost. He had chosen me in a certain way by not hiding the ledger, by allowing me to keep some pages unturned. We married in the ledger of our own making, a document both official and private. It didn't absolve the world of wrongs, nor did it transform every action into something noble. But it gave me a life where I could teach, where my brother could breathe easy, where I could go to sleep without thinking the van would return. Sometimes, when I walked the city at night, I felt the old prickle of being watched. Other times I felt the steady warmth of being seen by a man who would move heaven and hell to keep me from being hurt. The line was imperfect and jagged. It never smoothed into something pristine. I lived with the ambiguous knowledge that safety can be paid for. Sometimes by giving parts of yourself away, sometimes by making deals you would never have dreamed of in the days before the bruise. Years later, when a neighbor asked about the scar and whether it had hurt much, I found myself laughing, which is what you do when you want to keep things light. It hurt, I said, because truth matters, and because the truth was not only a wound, but a marker of passage. It also taught me something about who watches over me, and why. He nodded, a simple act that said more than any sermon. And are you glad you faced him? He asked. I thought of that night in the restaurant, of the tablet blinking like a heart monitor, of the van, of the man who had bruised me, and of the man who had promised retribution. I thought about the ledger, and the choices, and the smell of cedar. I thought about my brother's laugh, and about the literacy class, where an older woman had finally learned to sign her name. I thought about the small shoebox of letters and the mornings I stole to myself, the uncurated hours that I had fought to keep. Yes, I said at last. But I faced more than him. I faced the decision about what kind of life I wanted, I chose to be seen with conditions. I chose to keep some things for myself. Dante came up behind me then and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. He kissed the scar lightly, a gesture both possessive and reverent. "You did well," he said again. He had watched me grow, and in the watching there had been love and protection and the constant hum of his ledger. The bruise healed into a pale line that everyone who cared for me learned to read in their own way. To me, it was a map. Places I had been and what I had chosen as a result. To Dante, it was a thing to be guarded and maybe even admired in a complicated way. To the world, it was a private blemish on a life that had learned to survive. We did not convert the ledger into a hymn of absolution. We kept it messy and real, full of compromises and daily choices. I still had nights of doubt. He still had his instincts that could be violent. We argued and made up and made decisions and sometimes failed. But in the end I could say this with the blunt truth of experience. I had faced him, as the phrase had intended. I had faced the man who had hurt me and I had faced the man who would answer for it. I had faced my own fear and the thin, terrible choice between being invisible and being watched. "You will face him," he had said at dinner, poems on a tablet and light on his face. It had been both a command and a promise. When I faced the bruise aloud, I did more than expose a wound. I made a choice about how I wanted to live in a world that offers safety at a price. I had chosen, imperfectly, the price that kept my brother warm and let me go back to school. I had chosen a life where my liberty was not absolute, but where my agency mattered. And in the quiet after all of it, when my brother's cough was only a memory and the city had shifted its sounds around us, Dante would still trace the pale line on my forearm and kiss it like a benediction. Sometimes that kiss felt like possession, and sometimes it felt like protection. Mostly it felt like a question we both answered the same way, day after day. If you liked the kind of stories that live on the edge of danger and desire, where choices are complex and protection has a cost, like and subscribe. If you want more stories about dangerous love and darker choices, there's another tale reading go checked. The link in the description. I still wake sometimes to the memory of rain on my eyelashes and the black car waiting at the lamppost. The memory is sharp and clean, and it is mine. I know now that when someone says, "You will face him," it can mean a lot of things. It can mean standing in front of the person who marked you and telling the truth. It can mean choosing the kind of life you want, even when the options are all ugly. It can mean letting someone watch you and deciding what price you will pay for what you gain. I had been invisible once. Now I was seen, with a cost and a shelter. I had learned to live with both. The scar on my arm had faded into a pale line that frowned when I moved my hand. Dante kissed it sometimes, gently, like a small apology and a promise. I traced it with my own fingers until the skin remembered the story of that night, the van, the tablet, blinking like a heart monitor, and the ledger we kept in the quiet rooms of our life. "You will face him." And when I did, I had to decide what to do with the man who answered and with myself.